Hello and welcome everybody to the Pain Geeks podcast. This is our June 2026 edition. Hello, Christine.
Hi, nice to see you.
Well, how unusual to see you,
Yeah,
Christine.
yeah.
No, welcome and hello. Let's get some introductions off the start, and then we can just dive straight in. My name is Laura Rathbone. I'm a pain specialized physiotherapist working psychologically informed with complex and chronic pain patients here in Amsterdam, and I am one of the co-founders of Pain Geeks. And yeah, I guess this is just the thing we like to do, isn't it, Christine? Talk about pain
hmm
and research and evidence. And I will hand you over to my lovely friend, Christine.
Yes, that's true. We are pain geeks, hence the name. My name is Christine. I'm a physiotherapist living and working in Cyprus. I am an MSK physiotherapist with a special interest in pain and complex chronic conditions. And yeah, exactly what you said. Pain Geeks is a place to sort of put all of those special interests and all of those passions and all of those questions and
Hmm.
musings about what is happening in the clinical space.
What is happening?
What is happening? Yeah. Which is a very valid question that we are
Yeah.
asking ourselves every day. And
Yeah.
I think it's great that there's a space for that.
Yeah. I
Mhm.
think what we were sort of mentioning before we came on as well, like, don't get it twisted. Like, we take our job very, very seriously, but we don't take ourselves very seriously sometimes, right? So,
Mm.
what I love about this space is we do allow each other to sort of I don't know, be lost, be nervous, be confused, make mistakes, be silly, and also, appreciate just the randomness of some of the experiences that our patients are unfortunately having to go through. And what does that mean, biologically and like from and therapeutically? Like, where do we go from here? Because it is really hard what we're seeing in patients, what they're having to live with, and being asked to bear witness to that is a heavy, heavy part of our role. Um, but it's also kind of wild sometimes when you think about the difference between what somebody is actually experiencing and what the textbooks say or what the theory says, and how flat that theory feels compared to the richness of this experience that even though it is distressing and terrible, and but it is so big and rich compared to the way it's described. I mean, I was looking at the McGill pain questionnaire the other day and I was like, oh,
Mm.
this just doesn't quite capture it,
hmm
these sort of like predetermined pain describers. Um, and how wonderful it is to see someone really explore what their pain is and use narrative and pictures and color and all of this. It gives you a very it's a bit of a wild roller coaster trying to make sense of that with people in the room, right?
100%. And I think that, what you're describing is there is like two sides of that, like I think what, sort of what we were saying before is that like, um, there is a lot of stuff happening in that clinical space. And what is it that is happening is it is hard to witness that sometimes, especially if you have this feeling of I don't know what to do, I don't know how to help.
Mm,
And to sort of not, I'm not going to say come to the other side because it's not like there's all the answers on the other side, but to sort of shift into a different space is to embrace that uncertainty and to embrace that grayness and to be allowed to be confused and to have questions and to feel uncertain, right? Like if that
mm,
doesn't exist, then you can't move into that space.
yeah.
And I think that that's the point of what we are trying to create with Pain Geeks, right? Like, in order to get to that space where you can potentially be of service, useful, helpful in any way, you have to be able to sit in that space.
Hmm.
Um, so this is
Yeah.
what we are trying to allow for
Yeah.
ourselves, but for everybody also, because we found that that's what we need.
Right, and I think that leads us beautifully into the sort of the main topic, the what we've been reading.
Mm.
So we are have just finished reading The Experience Machine: How Our Minds Predict and Shape Reality by Andy
Mm.
Clark. Beautifully
Yes.
modeled there. Um, and been reading it for the last 3 months, and like even just pressing record on this podcast this
Mm.
morning, like took me a couple of attempts because I was like, no, I'm nervous, I'm nervous, because it is, predictive processing is a really, on the one hand, it feels like it should be so simple. It's just a simple flip, right? We're just thinking
Mm.
about the sort of the perceptual system as predicting the world. Um, and yeah, that's different to how we were brought up in biology, in biological theory and conscious theory. But it is somehow overwhelming at the same time. Like my heart rate goes up every time I get asked about predictive processing. And I've been reading
Hmm.
about this for a while, and I'm very lucky that I have people who are experts in this field, and I would class them as friends. But it does make me nervous.
Hmm.
Like
Maybe because like the foundations are like a heavy mathematical model.
maybe just casually a heavy mathematical
Yeah.
model. One, what is it? It's like the Lord of the Rings, isn't it? It's like one equation
Yeah.
rule them all.
Yeah. Yeah.
Give inference, and it's
Yeah. There's a lot
yeah,
going on
yeah,
there.
maybe maybe there's just some childhood trauma or mathematical childhood trauma popping up. But I mean, ultimately, this is it's a theory, and it's there to help us make sense of our work. But learning the theory in and of itself can be quite scary, can't it? And that's partly what we've been hearing about from our members when we bring up predictive processing. And this is actually, I think it's the third book that's focusing on predictive processing, because we did Mark Psalms. Oh no, fourth, because we've read
Fourth,
The
maybe.
Hidden
Yeah.
Spring, we've read The Experience Machine now, we've read How Emotions Are Made, and we've read Out of Our Heads by Alvin Noe. Oh no, no, it was Action and
Antonio
Perception.
Damasio's book,
Oh
Feeling and
yeah.
Knowing. Okay, so five.
Yeah, so we've sort of been on this journey, slowly chipping away. Not to mention, we've also read predictive processing theory papers. So we read Julian Kiverstein, Mick Thacker's, and Michael Kirchhoff's paper, um, embodied predictive processing theory of pain. So we've been sort of chipping away at this over the last couple of years and building it up alongside other areas as well. Um, yeah, and the feeling is sort of that this sort of makes sense. It feels exciting and interesting, and at the same time hard to get your head around. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm sure that just despite what seems maybe also like we have done a lot of reading around it, I'm sure we're going to do a lot more
Yeah.
reading around it as well in the future. Um, because there is this sense like sort of Margie and I were talking about this in the last discussion that
Yeah.
it sort of slips through your fingers a little bit, you feel like, which is, a very common experience with lots of things that you're trying to learn. Takes a lot of repetition and time
Mm.
and
Yeah.
coming at things from different angles.
And I think I mean, and you mentioned Margie there, so that's just to say that like what we're doing in this podcast is reflecting on the conversations we have in our Super Geeks subscription. So Pain Geeks is a very big, is a wider sort of free community of pain interested clinicians and researchers and advocates, people with lived experience. Um, but then, we also have this subscription which allows us to, and the funding from that allows us to keep going and to sort of redirect funds back into our community. And the Super Geeks subscription also gives you access to our sort of real-time conversations, so you can be in the room with us and other clinicians from around the world talking about these problems. And you can also get access to all of the recordings of those conversations and all of our expert interviews and workshops and resources that we've been building in behind the subscription as well. So
Hmm.
When we're talking about some of the conversations we've had, what we're really reflecting on are those Super Geeks conversations. And of course, anyone can join. You just have to head on over and subscribe.
Hmm.
That's a shameless
That's right. Yeah.
bit of advertising there.
Yeah.
But the more people that do that, the longer we can go as a platform, and the more people we can help. So that's the point. But
And the richer our discussions become, right? Every time a new super geek
exactly,
joins the crew, it just
yeah,
gets better.
it just gets better, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Yeah. And I think the thing with predictive processing as well, and one of the things that we've talked about in the group is that it's a theory that is being applied in different ways. And that's also quite hard to recognize and to reconciliate that. Like, for example, Andy Clark speaks very much to a sort of brain-centric way of discussing predictive processing. So did Lisa Feldman Barrett. But you might find other writers, other philosophers, other thinkers use more embodied cognition in this sort of wider sense. So, like the whole system is the model, not necessarily just the brain modeling, and that's also makes it, I think, more complicated because within the family of sort of different applications of this theory of predictive processing, you have to also figure out which one do you feel more in a line with, because neither is right and wrong, right?
Hmm.
They're just being applied, and there's limitations and pros and cons to each way of applying it at the moment. There's no
Hmm.
question there. There's just
Yeah.
just it's just
Yeah.
mind vomit.
Hmm. No, I agree with that. I mean, I was thinking about how, that's the case also in clinical practice too. I think
Mhm.
especially modern, I know that I'm not going to say modern clinicians. It's been going on for ages, right? Like depending on how you are trained and who's been your teacher and, what schools of thought you've sort of, been biased towards or whatever. Um, that's happening in your application, right? In the
Mhm.
clinical practice. And sometimes we don't think a lot about which framework we're working out of. And I think sometimes that's where a lot of the confusion in clinical practice can happen because we are
Mm,
perhaps working out of multiple frameworks and we're not aware of that. And sometimes they're
yeah.
conflicting and that's confusing. And,
Mhm.
I'm not saying that I know all the time exactly which framework I'm working out of, but like, I'm starting to become more aware of that
Yeah.
actually there are choices that I can make.
Yeah.
It's not that one is wrong and one is right. It's that I can apply from this framework here, I can apply from this framework here, and I have sort of some choice in that.
Yeah, I would say though, like, so when you're talking about frameworks, do you mean like clinical frameworks? Like,
Yeah, I
yeah.
mean, like,
So like
if I'm,
a trauma-informed framework versus a
yeah,
psychologically informed framework versus an
versus like a strict
injury-based.
pathoanatomical framework.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. I think that's fair, but I think if we're going to move around between them, we probably need to have a good sense of what our theory of pain is,
Yeah,
so
this
that
is
we
true.
don't get pulled into different theories. I think
Yeah.
this is what happens when clinicians give pain education about pain being an output of the nervous system, which, we
Mm.
may have opinions on. But
Hmm.
fair enough, it's the dominant way of discussing pain at the moment. But then don't acknowledge the nervous system in any of their therapeutic approach.
Hmm.
Right. So like that is a real conflict there in
Hmm.
between the frameworks that you're using because you don't necessarily know your theory of pain. So
Hmm.
it's easy to do that if
Yeah.
you haven't got a theory of pain or a philosophy of pain, which
Hmm.
is one of the things that we're sort of we're working to hold a space for people to explore without saying, what we've obviously got our own bias and not always are we in agreement, right? So it's not always
Hmm.
about having the same one. Um, but it's about encouraging people to engage with their own interpretation of the evidence and to use that as their guide, right? And I think
Hmm.
that's where it gets really tricky when we start thinking about predictive processing, because it's asking for skills that we might not necessarily have nurtured, because it's things like, what does it mean to be a sentient being in the world? How are we building experience? What is pain? Is pain a perception that we're
Hmm.
building based upon information, which sounds obvious maybe as someone who experiences pain and has we've all got our own knowledge of pain. But it isn't obvious if you've been taught that pain is a sort of sensory situation, that it's a response to injury, and it's like then it isn't necessarily obvious, and so
Hmm.
so we have to try. It's asking us to reconcile, I think,
Hmm.
some of those conflicts or questions or contradictions, and help, and in a way making us very aware of them, which then makes us, well, I don't know about you, but I'm hyper aware of what I'm saying in clinic now, and I'm like, oh, is that right? Is that really what I mean? And I think that can sometimes be a bit tricky.
Hmm.
Um, but we sort of were talking before we came on about what we took away from our conversations that we thought was like, oh, I want to explore that more, or that was helpful. Um, and yeah, should we talk a little bit about that? We
Hmm.
mentioned the sort of, uh,
I thought it was very, I mean, one thing I had mentioned was that it was really nice to see, I mean, it's always nice to see it in yourselves, but also in our
mhm,
members, right? To see that active learning in real time, you know?
mhm,
I think that's always really beautiful and nice to see. And we have one member who has been coming for a long time, and she's very engaged with material, and
mhm,
is really active in that learning process. And one of the revelations that she made during these discussions was starting to understand the different weight of predictions, and that she was starting to put together this picture of that it's not that we are equally predicting, the environment, and then there's stuff coming in from the environment, but that it seems to be more heavily weighted towards that we are predicting things, and then we are searching to match that in the environment.
yeah,
And that was really interesting because that is an interesting perspective, right? Like, was because
yeah,
that changes your entire understanding of how we work as organisms, that creates a much more active organism, right? That is
yeah,
that is actively searching and engaging with the environment to satisfy whatever is happening inside. And satisfy whatever's happening inside is based on whatever has been created throughout a sort of lifetime of experience
yeah,
and learning, and
yeah,
and connecting with the context and the environment. Um, but that's a different perspective to take than an organism that is sitting around sort of receiving information from the outside and just responding to it
yeah,
accordingly, whatever that means.
yeah. Mix
Um,
sensory couch potato.
yeah, the couch potato, that's right. And that's a very interesting, and for lots of different reasons,
Yeah,
sort of click to have.
yeah,
And it was also a reminder, like I'm also learning these things at the same time. And sometimes you have that concept sort of there, but then
mm,
when somebody else says it out loud towards you, you connect with it a little bit more. And
yeah.
yes, that's important. That's saliency there,
I'm paying
it's
attention.
coming, it's coming and it's staying.
Yeah.
So I was appreciative of that very much. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that you speak to a really nice process there that is like in the group learning space. Sometimes we're not necessarily saying anything new, we're just kind of repeating ourselves, but in different ways, um,
Hmm.
which actually is sort of part of the therapy role, and there's a chapter in this book about how do we integrate this theory into therapy? What does it mean for us? What how does it help us explain some of the stuff we're already doing, and like repetition, reframing, um, giving people new bits of language to construct their sort of sensory predictions and experiential predictions might be a helpful part of the updating process. Um, I think that's sort of, it's so weird. You're having this kind of like meta experience at the same time, like you're reading about the theory and thinking about your patients, and at the same time going through the process of updating. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, this idea that like we're not simply responding to sensory information about a world that exists. We're actively, you know, working to meet the sensory prediction. Um, and we're actively building our world whilst living in a very real, factual world at the same time.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
I think that's really helpful, and I think also remembering that like the sensory error and the sort of the predictions, this active inference that we're talking about, this sort of like actively inferring on the world what we are expecting to exist or what we're expecting to experience is not only happening between our sort of uh, predictions, so the predictions we make based on our previous experience, our priors, about the external world, but it's also happening about our internal physiology. So we're expecting our internal physiology to be a certain way as well. And so we've got these like really complex streams of information coming through. And that's what they talk about, like exteroception. So being able to engage and receive information from the world, and then proprioception, information about where your body is in space and time, that sort of conduit space between you and the world. And then there's interoception, which is this inner world, which is equally as complex and equally as busy and equally as weighted, equally as important. Is all coming together to help make us more precise with each prediction in each moment. And when we're thinking about pain states, and we've had little chats about this on Super Geeks, haven't we? So what does this mean for our patients? Like, how do we see this in action? Um, and I think when we're seeing context be powerful enough to shift a pain experience, we could. That's quite hard to explain if you're talking about sensory signals from the tissues, but it becomes quite not easy to explain because I'm not gonna say I don't know, I don't want to use the E word when it comes to
Hmm.
actual,
Hmm.
because I'm not sure that ever really applies. But like
Hmm.
you've got more narrative to draw on in a way. Is it
Hmm.
like, for example, if you've got someone who we were talking about, some you were giving a good example this morning about swimming. Do you want to give your example in a way that
Yeah, it's a
really protects the patient and
of
anonymizes the
course.
patient, but like,
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, this is a patient that has been struggling with long-term pain
Mm,
for a while. And, one of the main complaints is this feeling of having no energy, being very low energy and very
hmm
frustrated by that experience. But was also explaining to me the other day how they have recently been, swimming, engaging with swimming more in their pool and doing like, like 50 laps of like 9 meters and stuff, like a good amount of
hmm
physical exercise, and feeling energized from it and
mm,
feeling really well. And yeah, it was just a really interesting contrast for me. And, I was trying to seize that moment in the in the clinical room to sort of, maybe put a little bit of error, I don't know if that's the right way to say it, but into this idea of like, but is it that you don't have any energy for anything? And, why is it that in that context you
Hmm.
have a totally different sort of internal, um, what's the word? Like internal reading,
Hmm.
of what's going on, or interpretation of what's going on inside of your body and your whole experience as like, as a person. And isn't that interesting? And should we just think about that for a moment, and like what
Mm.
might be the factors that are playing a role in that shift of perception? And
Mm.
did you notice that? What does that mean? What do you think that means? Um, and that's it, right? Like I tried not to say like this is why this is what's happening because I don't know, but I just think like let's see if we can just stay there for a moment and explore it and possibly open up a little bit of room to start maybe generating different predictions. I don't know, but
Yeah.
like that's kind of what I was thinking, and I've thought about those things before, of course, with clients and maybe have done something similar, but I think this was the first time that I really maybe contextualized it for myself in that way.
Mm.
And it was also helpful to maybe to have a little bit of a different framework, talking about frameworks to sort of like lean on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think what I love about I mean, you can tell in this book just how many therapists have informed the way Andy makes sense of, things like psychotherapy and pain therapy. And obviously there's some of our friends are named explicitly in the book, and
Mm,
you can read the impact because so often when you read these books, they don't speak to the therapist experience of what we're doing. But Andy explicitly talks about the role of therapy as being a way of exposing some of those almost like unconscious, because they're so highly precise, they're so deeply deeply what's the word, embedded is the sort of word I'm looking for, but I'm not sure that's the right one, within this person's predictive model of themselves in the world, that they almost can't reflect on the variation and their own generated data. And
hmm
what we might be able to do as a way of sort of hacking the system is be able to be like, oh wow, have you observed that there is this shift, that context does make a difference in your pain, without, say, using that as a weapon against them to be like, see, I told you it was all in your head, like,
hmm
because that's
hmm
bullshit, isn't it? But
Yeah,
like, but using it as a
totally.
way to be like, hey, no, but your pain is really valid and it's also changeable. And we're not going to use that changeability to devalue it or dismiss it. We're going to use that changeability to get to know it better and then be able to figure out, okay, why, if in this context, why does my body show up differently for me? And that doesn't take away from the fact that you have this experience of chronic pain, but it just gives us a little bit more fine grain nuance to what
Mm.
those experiences are, and that might be helpful, right? And and maybe we don't really like, a human being is doing so much on the inside, right? There's so many cognitive and reflective and translational processes happening inside this skill of being a human and acting in the world. Maybe we don't need to do a lot. Maybe we do just, maybe just observing it and naming it and saying like, hey, it's okay that sometimes your pain is different, right? In fact, actually, that is exactly what we expect. Pain is
Mm.
changeable. It does move, it does shift, and it's not always the same. And if we can allow it to not always be the same, but still be recognized and honored, then we can start looking at those differences and finding where the important bits of information are, so we can start using that to make life better, you know?
Mm.
Like, this is
hmm
valuable information. It's not something you should be hiding from your therapist because you think they're not going to take you seriously, you know? This is really valuable clinical information when you're working with
hmm
pain-informed clinicians our Pain Geeks. We're like, excellent,
hmm
this is nuanced data. We want,
hmm
right?
hmm
Um, and I think that's
Yeah.
something that they speak really, really well to in this book. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's also why we have our complex cases space, right?
Exactly.
Which is a place for us
Yeah.
alongside of the live discussions and the recordings
Yeah.
to ask our questions to Pain Geeks around the world and to have other people help us make sense of, what's going on
Yeah.
in those clinical interactions. So that's a really cool space for that as well. But
Yeah.
yeah. Hmm.
Absolutely. So, okay, let's round this up because
Hmm.
I mean we could talk for hours and hours and hours, couldn't we? Like,
We can
but
and we do.
we can and we do. Yeah, that's literally our job.
Yeah.
And our passion. But
Yeah.
okay, we also ended our conversation yesterday, I think, in a really nice way, and I wanted to bring this conversation between us in an end in that way, which is sort of like, would you recommend this book
Mm.
to, well, to people, clinicians, patients? Where, how are you feeling about this?
Yeah. I was saying in that conversation that yes, I would
Mhm.
definitely. I think that this book would be great really for anybody, especially actually really for anybody, especially for maybe a beginner or
Mm,
like an introductory book to predictive processing,
yeah.
um, because it is so accessible and
Mm,
so, or at least I found it quite easy to read because there are so many examples. And, it's very structured in the way that the
mm,
chapters are laid out. There's that last chapter about all of the different, the hacking the brain one you were talking
yeah.
about, all of the different types of treatments that, and how predictive processing could be, supported in those
Yeah.
mechanisms, yes, a mechanism for those. And that is just so cool and so usable for clinicians. So for sure for clinicians, and I would also say for sure for patients who are interested in
Yeah.
understanding maybe a little bit more about the flexibility of how our systems work, you know?
Yeah, I would say I think for patients it's really valuable because if you're in front of a clinician who isn't talking about your pain in terms of complexity and perception, then it's probably worth noticing that, right? Take what works for you from that in that situation, but also know that there is this other way of thinking about pain. So I
Hmm.
think it would be great for people to go out and read. And like, I think I took what you said, I took it a little bit even a step further and say, I think this should be essential reading on
Hmm.
physiotherapy undergraduates. Like, I think undergraduates especially should be reading this book because that is a period of your study where your teachers and your guides are profiting on your lack of critical thinking and you're because they are given permission to continue speaking in old-fashioned ways because the audience isn't skilled enough to ask the questions that people who have been around the block a few times would ask. And so I think if you are an undergraduate physiotherapist, especially because I really only speak to physio, but if you are a psychologist or if you are likely to work with anyone who is having a conscious experience in your career and your job is to engage with that in a meaningful way, I would say you should read this book um, because it will give you a perspective that will help you challenge dogma.
Hmm.
And not to suggest that this is the right way of thinking about it, because this is not a dogma. It's just an alternative way of interpreting the data that we've collected over the years and establishing a different way of how we might generate meaning and perception. Um, and that's really important because there are multiple perspectives on how human beings are doing what we're doing. Um, and we don't necessarily get exposed to that in our undergraduate, which means we become quite fragile to a very specific theory, which makes it hard for us to update. So if you're a new grad or a student out there, We
Mm.
recommend that I recommend, and I
Hmm.
think, I hope you
Mm.
agree, but
I
you
do.
know,
I
you're
do.
very welcome to be like, Laura, stop talking for me.
No.
But like that the experience machine, I think will be very challenging at that level.
Mm.
But my goodness, what a rich piece of reading to have early on in your career. Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's where we're at.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, it was a great choice. And we are moving on now to our
Hmm.
next quarter's book club, our
Yeah.
light summer reading of Kafka,
Yes.
The
Kafka on the beach.
Metamorphosis. Yeah, Kafka on the beach. Oh my goodness. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it is technically our fiction quarter.
Yeah, so we're reading The Metamorphosis, and we've
Yeah.
just spent like Christine and I have literally just spent like 15 minutes being like, which
Mm,
translation should we be going for?
yeah.
Because with these books, you know, like, and obviously a lot of the time we have the privilege of being first language English, and many of the books are written either in English or
Mm,
they're by people whose first language is English. So like. But this is one of those moments where we have to think, which translation do we read? Because the
hmm.
translation you read is important to how you're going to engage with that text. So will keep spending, I think, the next couple of days just considering that, and then
Mm.
we will release. And whether we read the same translation or whether we choose to read different ones, is something we're talking about as well. So if you are a
Yeah,
pain
totally.
geek, watch this space and get
Hmm.
prepared for Kafka's Metamorphosis on the beach.
Hmm. And if you have any suggestions for which translation, let us know in
Yeah,
the comments and
exactly.
we can use that information.
Exactly. And we're moving into psychologically informed practice in our next theme, I believe. So
Hmm.
I'm looking forward to talking to you about that because, you know, I have opinions.
I can imagine, yeah. That's good.
Yeah, I would have been labeled a witch with opinions. Okay, thanks everybody for listening and for being part of this. And if you are not a member already, please head over to paingeeks.community, become a free member of our wider community. And if you can, support the ongoing work that we're doing by joining our paid subscription and get access to all of those extra goodies and come and spend, you know, months, weeks, your weeks talking to us about
Mm,
pain and the evidence and
mm.
just how cool our job is that we get to work with people with pain, but also how hard it is. And let's support each other. So take care.
Yes. Bye.
Bye bye.